This episode is called Sleep Addict. In the fall of 2005, 29-year-old lawyer Anna Sumner leaned her elbows against her large wooden desk and stared at her computer screen. It was hard not to let her mind wander. She could see downtown Atlanta, Georgia, right from her office window. Anna yawned and stretched and then forced her eyelids to stay open. It was already 5 p.m., but she still had an important brief to finish before she could go home. Her attention wandered again, this time to the framed diplomas that hung on her wall. She had an undergraduate degree from Princeton, and she had received her law degree from Duke. She'd studied very hard in school and now had worked her way up the ranks at a very prestigious law firm. She was proud of everything she'd accomplished. Anna leaned back in her chair and kicked off her high heels. She was exhausted. Then again, she was always exhausted. In high school, she used to skip hanging out with friends just to go to bed early, which left her feeling totally isolated. During college, she routinely skipped breakfast to sleep in, and then showed up to class so hungry she couldn't even focus. Once, she'd flown cross-country for a friend's wedding, and then accidentally slept through the entire thing. Finding the energy to get through law school had been a constant struggle, and it was even harder as a young lawyer at a big firm where so much was expected of new people. Sometimes she feared that her constant fatigue was damaging the career she had sacrificed so much for. It was beyond frustrating. Anna had slept for at least 12 hours the night before, yet here she was, not feeling rested. It was like she was moving through a fog at all times. She always needed more sleep, but she knew she needed to keep working. Anna stood up and shook her arms, trying to get her blood moving. She opened her eyes as wide as she could. She shook her head back and forth and sat back down, determined to finish her work. But as soon as she started to type, her eyelids grew heavy again, and Anna nodded off, her cheek resting on the keyboard. The next thing Anna knew, she was slowly waking up. Her back ached from being hunched over in her chair. Her computer screen had gone to sleep too. She shook the mouse and the screen lit up, and she looked at the time. It was 6 a.m. Anna had just slept for 13 hours. She was completely disoriented, still wearing yesterday's clothes, and her brief was not finished. Anna immediately felt a knot form in her throat. She had been successfully hiding her sleepiness problem ever since she was a teenager when it began. She'd always been able to arrange her schedule to accommodate her constant need to sleep. But now that she had a job with a lot of responsibilities, she just didn't have that same flexibility. Anna had always prided herself on having a good work ethic and self-control, but now she realized that this was something she really just couldn't control. Sometimes when Anna felt really tired, she would think to herself, if I don't sleep right now, I feel like I could actually die. She knew that was not normal. This problem had gone on long enough, and it wasn't going to get better unless she sought out some help. A few days later, Anna drove to the Emory Clinic Sleep Center in Atlanta. It was inside an old, faded building undergoing significant renovations. In fact, there was still construction going on outside. Anna plugged her ears as she walked past jackhammers slamming into concrete. She checked in, and a few moments later, a gray-haired, round-faced doctor walked her back to a large exam room with chairs and a bed. He adjusted his glasses and then introduced himself as Dr. David Rye, the lead neurologist at the clinic. He motioned for Anna to take a seat and asked her about her symptoms. And she told him that she basically craved sleep the same way a drug addict craves a fix. No matter how much she slept, she never felt rested, and the constant exhaustion was totally debilitating. Dr. Rye nodded understandingly and suggested they begin with a very basic test. He asked Anna to simply take a nap, right there in the exam room. And so Anna laid down on the bed. She could still hear the loud construction noises going on outside, but it didn't bother her. Within moments, she was asleep. But just a few minutes later, Dr. Rye shook her awake, and then he diagnosed her with a disorder called hypersomnia. This is a catch-all term for extreme, unexplained sleepiness. It's thought that up to 5% of the entire population experiences it, though rarely at the level Anna was. So while it was a diagnosis, it really wasn't that specific. But for Anna, who'd never seen a doctor for her sleep problems before, having any diagnosis was progress. And she was even more optimistic when Dr. Rye suggested a treatment plan. He explained that in most cases, Extreme tiredness is caused by a lack of energy-promoting chemicals in the brain, with names like dopamine and norepinephrine. It's like having a car with no gas in the tank. So he prescribed stimulants for Anna. These medications increase the level of these energy-promoting chemicals the same way that caffeine does. For patients like Anna, it can feel like they have a full tank of gas again. And Anna was so excited about her stimulants that after she left the doctor's office, she went straight to the pharmacy. When she got there, a pharmacist handed her a paper bag with a couple of prescription bottles inside, and Anna didn't waste any time getting her first dose. Sitting in her car in the parking lot, she opened one of the bottles, shook a pill into her hand, and swallowed it. She couldn't wait to feel better. A few months later, Anna grabbed a stack of papers off the desk in her office. Her hands shook slightly as she slipped the papers into her shoulder bag. She stood up from her desk chair, and suddenly a wave of nausea washed over her. She'd taken her prescription stimulants that morning and had been taking them every day since Dr. Rai prescribed them. In some ways, the stimulants were working. She could get through a full day of work without needing a nap, but the side effects from the medication were terrible. She felt jittery and sick to her stomach, like she'd had way too many cups of coffee. She was losing weight because she never had any appetite. And even though she had felt kind of okay for a while on this medication, she was now starting to crave sleep again. As she walked outside and unlocked her car, all Anna could think about was getting home and going to bed. She got into her car, pulled out her phone, and called Dr. Rai. She told him about the side effects she was feeling and now how her craving for sleep was starting to come back. Dr. Rai assured her that this was actually normal. He told Anna her body was building up a tolerance to the drugs, and he'd simply prescribe her a higher dose. Anna was nervous about this. The stimulants were already giving her such bad side effects, and she thought taking more would really only make her feel worse. But at the same time, the medication was the only thing allowing her to make it through the day. So Anna agreed to the higher dose. She hung up, drove to the pharmacy, and picked up more medication. One year later, on a Friday in April of 2007, Anna was wrapping up her work for the week when the phone on her desk rang. It was her boss. He wanted her to come up to his office before she went home. Anna's hand trembled as she set down the receiver. She wasn't sure if the trembling was from a side effect of the stimulants or from nerves from what her boss just asked her to do. She knew what this conversation was going to be about, and she'd been dreading it for months. Anna had begun missing entire days of work without warning and without explanation. Even though she was constantly taking all of her stimulants, it wasn't uncommon for Anna to still literally sleep days away. Sometimes she'd go to bed and sleep for 20, 25, or even 30 hours straight. It didn't matter how many alarms she set either. Anna slept through all of them, only waking up when her body finally let her. Anna got up from her chair and her legs felt heavy. Even now, with adrenaline coursing through her body, all Anna wanted to do was sleep. It took all her strength to trudge down the hall to her boss's corner office. She knocked on the door, and then, in a somber tone, her boss asked her to come inside. Anna sat down across from his desk and tried to stay composed. She felt angry at her body for betraying her. She'd put in so many years of hard work, and she was sure that it was all about to slip away. But Anna's boss didn't fire her. He reassured Anna that he valued her contributions, but he was really concerned about her health. Though Anna rarely talked about it, her boss was quite aware of her sleep issue, and so he recommended that she take a 6-month leave of absence so she could get to the bottom of it. Anna didn't want to do this. She wanted to keep working, but she knew that taking this leave of absence was probably the right thing to do. If she couldn't be consistently relied on, she wouldn't be helping the firm, her clients, or herself. So she thanked her boss for understanding and promised to do everything she could to get back to work soon. The next afternoon, Anna was lying on her couch at home, trying to make sense of her struggles. She sipped on a cup of coffee and tried to watch TV, but as usual, she couldn't stop herself from nodding off. This time, though, waking up was worse than ever. Her head was pounding and the light coming in through the blinds seemed overwhelmingly bright. She had sharp hunger pangs in her stomach and her joints felt stiff and her muscles were weak and shaky. It took all her effort just to roll onto her side. She saw the TV had shut off and the cup of coffee she'd just been drinking was now totally cold, and the cream inside of the coffee was clearly rotten and curdled at the top of the cup. Anna was confused and grabbed her phone on the coffee table, and she checked the time and date. And what she saw literally did not seem possible. According to the time, Anna had just slept for 53 hours straight. It had been over 2 days since she'd laid down on the couch, but it felt like, a second had passed. Staring at the date and time on her phone, she felt sick. Her symptoms were really starting to frighten her. How long would she sleep the next time? A week? More? How could she live anything like a normal life if this was what happened to her? She called Dr. Rye's office immediately, and he thankfully had an immediate appointment available. As Anna dragged herself off the couch and walked out to her car, she felt weak and clumsy. Walking was like trying to pull her body through sludge these days. She gingerly lowered herself into the driver's seat and then drove straight to the Emory Clinic Sleep Center. Before long, Anna was in that familiar exam room sitting across from Dr. Rye. He seemed surprised to see her, but when she told him about falling asleep for 53 hours straight, his eyes went wide. Dr. Rye knew that spending so much time asleep could actually be dangerous. It meant Anna wasn't eating, drinking water, or exercising for days at a time. In the long term, this could lead to malnutrition, dehydration, and muscle atrophy. If she wasn't able to take care of herself, her body would eventually quit working. However, Dr. Rye said he did have an idea for what they could do next. It was a last-ditch effort and something he would not recommend unless it was absolutely an emergency, and clearly this was that. There was a test that could help them figure out what was causing her to sleep so much, but for it to be accurate, she needed to stop taking all the stimulants he'd been prescribing. Anna leaned back in her seat after hearing this. She knew the stimulants weren't perfect. No matter the dosage, she always needed more, and she was still sleeping way too much. But at the same time, the idea of not taking them scared her. If she could sleep for 53 hours with stimulants in her system, what would happen to her without stimulants? But in Dr. Rye's opinion, getting rid of the stimulants might be the only way to figure out what was happening inside of her brain. It would take about a month for the drugs to clear her system, so the doctor scheduled an appointment for a month from then, in May. Until then, the doctor explained to Anna that she really needed to be careful. Once she stopped taking these stimulants, she shouldn't drive, just in case she fell asleep behind the wheel, and she should have someone looking after her, making sure she ate, drank, and moved around every day. Anna realized that what the doctor was saying was, without these stimulants, she could not live alone anymore. And so, after she made it home from the clinic, she called her parents, who lived in Mississippi, and she told them she needed their help. Her parents immediately agreed, and her mother said she'd come to stay with Anna in Atlanta for as long as she needed. Anna was relieved to hear this, but at the same time, she was so tired she could barely function. She felt like she was literally sleeping her life away. A month later, in May of 2007, Anna's mom helped her get into the passenger seat of her car. With no stimulants in her system, Anna felt even more lethargic and totally confused. All she knew on this day was that they were going to the sleep clinic to see Dr. Rye. The whole ride, Anna sat with her head leaned against the window, watching trees and buildings blur together as she slipped in and out of consciousness. When they got to the Emory Clinic Sleep Center, Anna felt so stiff and heavy that her mom had to help her get out of the car. Anna could barely keep her eyes open as she leaned on her mom's arm, and then she shuffled her way into the clinic, feeling like she had cinder blocks stuck to her feet. Dr. Rye met Anna in the waiting area and walked her back to an exam room. They sat down, Dr. Rye in a chair and Anna on the bed. And as soon as Anna was sitting down, she started to feel herself beginning to fall asleep. As she struggled to stay awake, Dr. Rye explained the procedure they'd be doing that day. He said sleep was largely controlled by a person's brain. The brain uses nerves and chemicals to send messages through the rest of the body, and if the balance of these chemicals is thrown off, it could make someone sleep far too little or far too much. Dr. Rye thought this could be what was happening to Anna, but he needed to analyze the fluid inside her spinal cord to be sure. This meant he would need to insert a needle into the base of her spine and withdraw some of the fluid, a procedure known as a spinal tap. Dr. Rye instructed Anna to lay down on the bed in the fetal position with her back facing him. Then he injected a local anesthetic near her spine, and Anna's back went numb. Then Anna began to feel pressure and a burning sensation as Dr. Rai inserted the needle into her spine and removed a sample of her cerebrospinal fluid. When the procedure was over, Dr. Rai told Anna it would take a few days for the results to come back. And so Anna stood, her back numb and her whole body exhausted, and she shuffled out to the waiting room where her parents were sitting. Then the parents helped Anna out to the car, they got inside, and they drove back to Anna's house in Atlanta. Anna barely made it inside before she collapsed into bed and fell asleep. A few days later, Dr. Rai was getting ready to leave work to head home when one of his assistants rushed inside and told him that the results of Anna's test had come in. Dr. Rai adjusted his glasses and then peered down at the data on his computer screen. He reviewed the chemical breakdown of Anna's cerebrospinal fluid, and what he saw shocked him so much that he called over other doctors to take a look. Every sleep specialist at the clinic was totally surprised. The results were so bizarre that one doctor even started laughing at the absurdity of the numbers they were seeing. They had literally never seen anything like this. But while the other doctors stood in disbelief, Dr. Rai felt a mixture of hope and unease. He had seen results like this before, in an Italian sleep study from the 1990s. In that study, a group of people who had symptoms similar to Anna's were given an experimental drug that cured their sleepiness. It was a drug that Dr. Rai had on hand, which meant he might be able to use it to cure Anna too. But there were problems that made Dr. Rai hesitant. That Italian study had been discredited after the research was found to have some serious issues. Plus, the drug used in that study to cure their sleepiness was never approved by the Food and Drug Administration to treat sleep disorders, and it could cause bad side effects like seizures, so giving it to Anna would definitely be a risk. But faced with Anna's spinal tap results, Dr. Rai thought the risk was worth it, and so he called Anna and told her that he might be able to treat her sleepiness, but they need to do one more test. The next month, in June of 2007, Anna came back to the Emory Clinic. She'd been off the stimulants now for 2 months, and it felt like her body was close to shutting down on her, like she'd never be able to do anything except sleep again. Every footstep she took was a total battle. She dragged herself into the exam room and crawled into the bed. She felt a nurse lift her arm, swab near her wrist, and then jab her with an IV needle. Anna was vaguely aware of other movement in the room. Multiple nurses were standing by, just in case Anna had a bad reaction to the drug, like a seizure or worse. Anna watched as Dr. Rai rolled a screen into the room. Everything looked slightly blurry to her. She heard Dr. Rai say they were doing a test to measure her brain's reaction time, and then he put a remote in her hand and told her to press the button as soon as she saw numbers appear on this screen. Anna tried to follow his instructions, but at the same time, she felt herself drifting in and out of consciousness, and so when a number popped up, she would press the button like she was told to, but she could tell by the look on Dr. Rai's face that she was not doing a good job. After the test was over, Dr. Rai told Anna that her reaction times were similar to someone who had just been up all night, or who had been drinking very heavily. And so now that they had these control results, they could try the medication that Dr. Rai hoped would help her. Anna watched as Dr. Rai put something into her IV bag. The liquid dripped through the tube into her arm and into her bloodstream. But Anna didn't feel any better. Her head felt like a lead weight. Her eyes were so dry that they burned, and the whole room seemed foggy. It took everything in her not to slump over and let her eyes close. For a moment, she had a horrible feeling that this new treatment was not going to work. She would never be able to hold a job or even live by herself again. Then she heard Dr. Rai's voice at her side saying he was going to try a higher dose of this drug. Anna struggled to take a deep breath. She waited for something to happen. Then her eyelids snapped open. The room came into focus, and Anna felt like she could hear and see again, and she didn't feel a desperate urge to sleep. Dr. Rai ran the reaction time test again, and Anna didn't have to work to focus on the screen. The reflex test that had seemed impossible before felt very simple now. When they were finished, Anna looked up at Dr. Rai, close to tears, and she told him she felt alive. For the first time in her adult life, Anna felt truly awake. Dr. Rai watched Anna for a moment. In all the time he'd known her, he'd never seen her look this alert. She sat up straight, her eyes were clear and focused, and she was smiling at him. He couldn't help but smile back. It was incredible to see how much of a difference this drug was making. Dr. Rai sat down next to Anna and told her that he had never seen a patient like her before. Her brain was basically full of naturally occurring anesthesia. He explained that there's a chemical messenger in everyone's brains known as GABA, G-A-B-A, that helps regulate sleep. Many sleep aids and drugs used for surgical anesthesia make the brain respond more strongly to GABA. The stronger the response, the sleepier a person gets, Dr. Rai said. And the reason Anna's doctors were so shocked by her test results was because her naturally occurring GABA activity levels were as high as a person who was about to go into surgery. Every day of her life, 24 hours a day, Anna was walking around with the same level of sedation as a person about to have all their wisdom teeth removed. Dr. Rai watched Anna's jaw drop as she realized that she hadn't just been tired for most of her life. Her own brain had been literally knocking her out. This drug that Dr. Rai had given her was called flumazenil. Usually, flumazenil is used in hospitals to help people who are overdosing on sedatives or having trouble waking up from anesthesia. It's an emergency antidote for people whose GABA activity is too high. So for Anna, whose GABA activity was always too high, flumazenil made her brain function like a healthy person's brain. But the FDA never approved flumazenil for excessive sleepiness. The drug only came as an intravenous medication for use in hospitals, and the effects wore off really quickly. Anna would need to have intravenous injections every few hours to stay awake, and that just wasn't possible from a practical standpoint. So Dr. Rai worked with Anna and the drug maker over the next 8 months to get an exemption from the FDA that would allow her to take a daily flumazenil pill to prevent her sleepiness. The medication completely changed Anna's life. She's since gone back to work, been promoted to partner at the big prestigious law firm in Atlanta, and is enjoying what she calls, quote, the luxury of life. On a hot July afternoon in 2011, 43-year-old Roberto Ayala drove his white Ford F-250 truck down a private farm road past a field of sunflowers in full bloom. Roberto had worked that farmland outside of the small town of Colusa, California, since he was a young man, but looking out at that sea of yellow flowers in the sunlight still took his breath away. Roberto glanced over at the passenger seat and saw his 7-year-old son, Fabian, staring out the window, also transfixed by the flowers. Roberto smiled. He wanted all 3 of his kids to appreciate the beauty of nature as much as he did. The sunflower field was part of 1,800 acres of farmland owned by the Moore brothers, 2 wealthy and powerful men in their 70s. Roberto had started working for the Moore brothers decades earlier as a farmhand, and the brothers had taken to Roberto almost immediately. They thought Roberto was a natural farmer who understood the land even better than they did. And so the Moore brothers had quickly come to trust and rely on Roberto. They had looked to him to weigh in on major decisions about their farmland, like what to plant and when to plant it, and within a short period of time, Roberto had gained more responsibility within the Moore brothers' family business, and eventually they made Roberto their farm manager. Managing the Moore brothers' multi-million-dollar farm was a stressful job, but Roberto loved it, and he looked up to the Moore brothers like father figures who had given him a chance to succeed and who trusted him like he was part of their own family. In his truck, Roberto eased off the gas, pulled to the side of the road, and parked. He told his son Fabian to wait in the truck while he went out and did a couple of chores. Roberto's job, managing the Moore brothers' farmland, often required him to be on call 7 days a week, from sunup to sundown. So Roberto often took one of his 3 kids with him when he had to check on something at the farm. It gave Roberto a chance to spend some time with his kids, and he had already started to train his older son in aspects of farm management, in the hope his son would take over for him someday. But when Roberto was with his 7-year-old Fabian, he didn't pressure the boy to learn anything about farming unless Fabian asked. Roberto just liked sitting in his truck talking with Fabian in both English and Spanish, and giving him a chance to take in the beautiful Northern California scenery. Roberto grabbed a pair of rubber electrical gloves sitting between him and Fabian, and then he hopped out of the truck into the summer sun. Roberto was not a big guy, but he was very strong. He wore jeans, cowboy boots, and a cowboy hat, and he had salt and pepper hair and a thick, dark mustache. He took off his cowboy hat and wiped the sweat off his forehead with the back of his hand. Then he put his hat back on and walked away from the truck down the road a few feet towards a tall wooden pole that had a high-voltage electrical box on it about the size of a high school locker. Roberto slipped on his electrical gloves and opened the box. This large metal box was one of many on the Moore Brothers farmland that housed electrical switches that controlled irrigation pumps used to water the fields of different crops at different times. Roberto turned on the irrigation pump, closed the metal box, pulled off his gloves, and began walking back towards his truck. But he stopped on the side of the road when he saw another truck driving towards him. The truck stopped a few feet away from Roberto's truck, and Paul Moore, the son of one of the two Moore brothers, stepped out. Paul was 47 years old, he was 6 feet tall, good-looking, and he had brown hair and green eyes. Paul waved to Roberto's son, Fabian, who was still sitting in his dad's truck, and then Paul trotted his way over to Roberto. Roberto had worked alongside Paul for almost 20 years. When they were younger, they had both worked in the fields together, but now as Paul got older, he had moved more into helping run the business side of the family farm. Paul and Roberto got along well, and they regularly checked in with each other, and it was assumed by almost everyone in the company that when the older Moore brothers retired, Paul and Roberto would essentially run the farm together. Paul and Roberto asked each other how their families were doing, and then they shifted gears and began talking a bit about the current sunflower and rice crops growing on the farmland. But then Paul got a strange look on his face, like he was embarrassed by what he was about to say. Roberto asked him what was wrong, and Paul said it was about his cousin, Peter. Roberto smiled and kind of shook his head. It was rarely good news when Peter came up. Peter Moore was a couple years younger than his cousin Paul, and the two had basically been raised as brothers. Their fathers had run the family farming business together for decades, and they had always intended to pass the land and the business onto their sons, who they hoped would run things together just like they had. But Peter had just never seemed ready to take on any real responsibility. When he was young, he had worked in the fields alongside Paul and Roberto, but he always seemed angry about one aspect of the job or another. And over the years, he had gained the reputation of having a bad temper, and he spent a lot of his time complaining about the way he felt mistreated by his father and his uncle. And over the years, Peter had also made a habit of blaming a lot of his problems on Roberto. He said Roberto was arrogant and bad at his job, and that he didn't deserve the respect he got from the Moore brothers. On the side of the road, Roberto asked Paul what Peter had done. Paul took a breath and told him that Peter was looking for a fight with Roberto, like a real physical confrontation. Roberto laughed. That sounded like something a kid would say. But Paul told Roberto he was being serious. Peter had spent years taking martial arts classes, and now he wanted to literally fight Roberto. Roberto laughed again. He thanked Paul for the heads up, but he said there was no way he was going to physically fight Peter or anyone else for that matter. Then Roberto and Paul shook hands, said they'd talk soon, and walked back to their trucks. Once he was back in his truck, Roberto asked his son, Fabian, if he'd had a good time coming to work with him. And Fabian said he had, and that he wanted to come to work with his dad more often. Roberto said, "Great, it's a deal," and then he hit the gas, drove down the road, and left the field of yellow sunflowers behind them. That night, Roberto, his wife, and 3 children sat around the dinner table talking. And Roberto laughed all over again when he told his family about how Peter wanted to fight him. Fabian and his big brother laughed along with their dad, but Roberto's wife and daughter were not amused. Roberto's daughter didn't like Peter at all, and she didn't trust him. She had gone to work with her dad a lot over the years, and she was old enough to understand that Peter did have it out for her dad. In fact, Peter didn't even hide his disdain for Roberto, and she had heard Peter say mean things about her father right in front of her. But Roberto told his daughter and his wife that there was nothing to worry about. Peter was all talk, and he would never have the guts to actually try to fight him. But later that night, as Roberto's wife lay in bed next to him, she was still worried. As far as she was concerned, Peter was an angry, rich man who acted like the world owed him something. And she feared Peter would follow through with his latest threat, no matter how foolish Roberto thought it sounded. A couple of weeks later, on July 16, 2011, Roberto was back in his white Ford F-250 with his 7-year-old son, Fabian, at his side in the passenger seat. Roberto was in his usual work clothes, jeans, cowboy boots, and a cowboy hat, and Fabian wore a cowboy hat too, exactly like his dad's. At about 1 p.m., Roberto drove past the sunflower fields, and a few minutes later, he glanced out his window towards one of the Moore brothers' rice fields. He pulled the truck over and parked on the side of the road. Roberto told his son to wait in the truck, and then he grabbed his electrical gloves, and he hopped out and walked towards a large metal high-voltage box on a wooden pole like he had done a couple weeks earlier. It was time for Roberto to irrigate this rice field. As his dad walked off, Fabian stayed in the truck as he was told, staring back at the sunflower fields in the distance. The young boy already shared his dad's appreciation for the beautiful flower. Then suddenly, Fabian felt the ground begin to shake, and the windshield glass shattered. Without thinking, Fabian threw his hands up in front of his face, and he felt shards of glass stinging his arms. Fabian screamed and looked around, totally confused. Growing up in Northern California, Fabian was already familiar with earthquakes, and for a second, he thought that's what this must have been. But then, Fabian stepped out of the truck, and he felt an intense heat on his face. He stumbled towards where his dad had walked off to, and when he looked out towards the rice fields, he began screaming and crying. He called out to his dad, but his dad didn't respond. Fabian looked up and down the isolated farm road, but there was nobody in sight, so the 7-year-old boy just turned around and began running back down the road towards the sunflower field. Fabian ran as fast as he could, and as he did, his cowboy hat fell off the back of his head, but Fabian didn't even stop to pick it up. He just kept on running. Several minutes later, Fabian reached the sunflower field. He'd gone to work with his dad enough to know there was a small neighborhood on the other side of this field, so he rushed into the tall stalks of the flowers and ran through the field as fast and as hard as he could. But as Fabian ran, he felt his feet sinking into the mud that recent irrigation had caused. Fabian stopped, bent down, and pulled off his shoes and socks. Then he just kept on running through the field barefoot, holding his shoes in his hands. As he ran, tears streamed down his face, mud covered his feet, and his legs felt like they were on fire, but Fabian did not stop. Finally, after running 2 miles barefoot in the hot summer sun, the 7-year-old boy burst out of the field into a clearing. He looked up and he saw a few small houses on the other side of the clearing, so despite being totally out of breath, he forced himself to just keep on running. When he reached the other side, Fabian stumbled up the walkway to the first house he came to, and he knocked on the door and screamed at the top of his lungs. Seconds later, the door flew open, and a woman saw the little boy standing there yelling and covered in mud. The woman rushed out of her house, wrapped her arms around the boy, and pulled him inside. She asked him what was going on, and Fabian coughed and wheezed, and he looked up at the woman and he told her he had come from the rice field with his dad, and his dad was on fire. The woman grabbed her phone and immediately dialed 911. A few minutes after the woman called 911, Detective Dave Salm of the Colusa County Sheriff's Department stepped out of the small sheriff's station and walked across the lot to his car. Along with this 911 call, the sheriff's department had gotten multiple calls from people all over the place saying they had heard a loud explosion coming from the Moore brothers' farm. Detective Salm got into his car and headed out towards the farm road near the rice field where Roberto and Fabian had been. Calls like this were not a regular thing in Colusa County, but they weren't too out of the ordinary either. As a sheriff's detective, Salm spent a good amount of his time investigating potential industrial accidents in the area. Farming was dangerous business, and unfortunately, Salm had witnessed his share of serious injuries and deaths related to faulty farm equipment and just plain bad luck. Thick black smoke hung in the air as Salm pulled onto the farm road that led to the rice field. He hit the gas and sped toward the road, and soon he could see the swirling lights of the fire trucks up ahead. And as he got closer, The heat from a burning fire hit him even inside of his car. Salm pulled over to the side of the road far enough away from the scene that he wouldn't interfere with the fire department who was trying to put out the fire. And after several minutes, the fire department got the blaze that had engulfed part of the rice field under control. By that time, a few other officers from the sheriff's department had arrived, so Salm led his small investigative team down the road to where the fire had been put out. He walked past Roberto's white truck, and he saw shattered glass from the windshield and windows scattered over 10 feet on the ground. Then he walked closer to the rice field, and he saw the splintered fragments of what used to be a tall wooden pole. The large metal box that had once been attached to this pole was nowhere to be found. Just then, a member of the fire department approached Salm. The two men had worked together several times before. The firefighter led Salm and his team past pieces of metal on the ground and around behind one of the fire trucks. When they got back there, Salm could still see the smoke in the air and he could feel it in his lungs, and he covered his mouth and his nose and then looked down at the ground. And when he did, he shuddered. Because he was staring at the burnt remains of a person. It was the charred body of Roberto Ayala. Detective Salm tried to catch his breath, but the smoke and the shock of the sight of Roberto made it very hard to breathe. Salm had investigated plenty of industrial accidents, but he'd never seen anything even close to this. Salm knelt down to get a better look at Roberto, and it was obvious he'd been badly burned for an extended period of time. But Roberto's cowboy boots looked like they'd almost remained untouched. So Salm got down as low as he could and craned his neck to get a good look at the bottom of Roberto's boots, and he saw there were several burn holes, each an inch wide on the sole of the boots. Salm called over members of the fire department. He thought he knew what those burn holes meant, but he wanted a second opinion. So a few of the firefighters crouched down next to Salm, and they looked at Roberto's boots as well, and all of them agreed the holes on the bottom were a clear sign of electrocution. Even though the wooden pole had been obliterated, Salm knew there had been a high-voltage unit attached to it at some point. So he sent members of his team to go look for parts of this locker-sized metal box that would have housed the electrical switch that controlled the irrigation pumps. And while the team fanned out to look for remnants of the box, Salm and members of the fire department talked through what they thought they were seeing. They had all encountered electrocution in industrial accidents, but this scene just seemed different than anything any of them had dealt with before. There was so much damage to the wooden pole, to the rice field, and even to Roberto's truck that this looked like a far bigger thing than just a malfunction within the high-voltage box. Detective Salm prided himself on his work ethic and his commitment to his community, but he never pretended to be some kind of Sherlock Holmes who could figure everything out. And he was more than willing to admit that he had no idea what had happened to Roberto and that he badly needed help investigating this. And so Salm grabbed his phone and reached out to Pacific Gas and Electric, the utility company that provided natural gas and electricity services to millions of Californians. And later that day, that company sent crewmen out to the scene, but when they arrived, they felt as lost as Detective Salm was. They told him they had never seen a blast radius on that scale in any kind of incident involving a high-voltage unit like the one Roberto would have been using. Then, members of Salm's team returned to the scene with the door of the high-voltage box that was on that pole, and they said they had found it over 150 feet away from where it had first been on the pole. And when Salm and members of the fire department heard how far that door had flown from this explosion, they admitted that they really didn't know if the explosion had been an accident or if maybe it had been caused by a bomb on purpose. On July 17th, so the day following the deadly explosion, Detective Salm drove back out to the farm road where Roberto had been killed. As Salm drove, he felt his eyelids getting heavy. He'd barely slept at all since arriving at the scene the day before, and he still didn't even know if he was dealing with an accident or a crime. But that was not what had kept him awake. The night before, Salm and members of his team had checked on Roberto's son, Fabian, at the hospital, where the boy had been brought after running 2 miles barefoot to get help for his father. Then the officers had driven Fabian home. Roberto's wife had gotten the initial call from police telling her that Fabian had been taken to the hospital. Roberto's wife spoke Spanish, and she usually had Roberto or one of the kids translate for her. But nobody else had been in the house when she had gotten the call, and so there had been communication issues between her and the police officer on the other line. That meant when police had arrived at the house with Fabian, his mother, Roberto's wife, still didn't know what had happened to her husband. And when Fabian had walked in, she ran and hugged him and then asked where his dad was. And Fabian, the 7-year-old, had to tell her that dad is dead. Everything about the scene at the house had been totally gut-wrenching. Roberto's family cried, while the 2 oldest kids translated the story of what had happened to their father to their mother. And all the while, they all tried to make sure Fabian was somehow okay after having just seen his father's body burning right in front of him and then needing to run 2 miles at a dead sprint to try to get help. In his car, Salm shook himself awake and focused on the road ahead of him. And after he'd driven a couple of miles, he saw up ahead a swarm of law enforcement vehicles blocking the road. Seeing the heartbreak of Roberto's family right up close and personal had made Salm really want to figure out what had happened to Roberto as quickly as possible, and that meant he first had to determine if Roberto's death was an accident or a murder. But by the end of the previous day, Salm and the others had still been at a total loss. So Salm had done the only thing he could think of. He contacted 2 federal agencies for help: the Federal Bureau of Investigation, so the FBI, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, or ATF. The ATF was the agency that investigated federal crimes involving arson, explosives, and bombs. Salm parked his car on the farm road, stepped outside, and almost instantly regretted his decision to call the feds. The appearance of the FBI and ATF had surely already terrified residents in that small town near the Moore Brothers farm, and those agencies could completely overwhelm a county's resources while taking over from local law enforcement. Salm smiled and waved at the big group of feds out in front of him as he approached a particular ATF agent who was on the scene, but all Salm could think about was how he had possibly brought this circus to town for nothing more than maybe just an industrial accident. The ATF agent he approached introduced himself to Salm. The agent was tall and skinny, and he wore glasses, and Salm thought the guy seemed oddly excited for somebody who was in town to investigate a horrible death. But the ATF agent told Salm that they found evidence he needed to see. The agent led Salm down the road past several other members of the ATF and also the FBI, and then walked him over to a large piece of metal that was laid out on the ground. The agent said someone had found this piece of metal in a canal not far from the rice field and brought it to the agents because the person thought it might have something to do with the explosion that had occurred. And the agent said that that person was right. He crouched down and motioned for Salm to do the same, and then once they both were down there, the agent pointed to a series of markings on this piece of metal. Salm just stared at the agent and asked him what they were looking at. The agent said he would need to run a series of tests on the metal fragment to determine exactly what had happened, but the markings on the piece clearly indicated that some type of bomb had been detonated in the high-voltage box that housed the switch for the irrigation pump. In short, the agent said this had not been an accident at all. Somebody had definitely murdered Roberto Ayala. Detective Salm exhaled, and his shoulders relaxed. He was horrified that somebody would want to kill Roberto, a man who was well-liked in the area, who was also a husband and a father. But this news at least let Salm know that he had been right to ask for help from the FBI and ATF because this was a crime. The ATF agent told Salm it would take some time for them to search the entire site and to run all the tests they needed to run, but Salm could definitely launch a murder investigation immediately. Salm thanked the agent, and then he headed back to the sheriff's station to regroup with his investigative team and to inform them they now had a very public murder case on their hands. But it didn't take long for investigators to get their first lead. That afternoon, Salm got a call from a guy who said he had to talk to him immediately. The man's name was Paul Moore, and he said he might know who killed Roberto. Later that day, Paul Moore, the heir to the Moore Brothers farming business, stepped into the sheriff's station. Salm had been waiting for Paul to arrive, and so when he did, he went right over to him, shook his hand, and thanked him for coming in. Everybody in the sheriff's department knew Paul well from just living in the area, and they were used to seeing him laughing, telling stories, and pretty much just lighting up any room he walked into. But Salm could tell on this day, something was very wrong. Paul looked pale and worried, and when he greeted Salm, his voice was quiet and shaky. Salm, along with another detective, led Paul into a small office and closed the door behind them so they could talk privately. Paul took a seat at a small table, and the detective sat down across from him. Then Salm asked Paul what prompted him to reach out to police. Paul cleared his throat, and then in a quiet voice, he told them what had happened over the course of the last day. Paul said that he and his father had been eating a late lunch together when they got the call about Roberto. At first, both men had just sat there in shock. Roberto was like part of their family, and they couldn't even come to terms with the fact that he was now gone. But once they heard there had been some sort of explosion and that's what had killed Roberto, they immediately began to blame themselves. Everyone in the company, including Roberto, was diligent about keeping their equipment as safe as possible. So the idea that a faulty electrical box had just killed Roberto just destroyed Paul and his father. But then, earlier that morning, after the ATF and FBI had rolled into town, Paul and his father knew something else was going on. And because of their status in town, they had been able to get information quickly about what appeared to be a criminal investigation, not a query into an industrial accident. Salm and the other detective nodded and said Paul was right. There was no use pretending the Moore family didn't know everything about what was happening on and around their farm at all times. But Salm then followed up and said, well, okay, but why did that prompt you to reach out? Paul looked both detectives in their eyes, and he said as soon as he realized somebody may have killed Roberto, there was only one person who came to mind, and that was his own cousin, Peter. A look came across Salm's face like he'd just heard the most obvious thing ever, and he couldn't believe he hadn't already thought of it. Detective Salm, like almost everyone in town, knew about Peter's bad temper and about his strained relationship with his father and his uncle. Paul said that his cousin Peter had always been a total jerk to Roberto, and just recently, he had even threatened to physically fight Roberto. Paul usually just told himself that his cousin was all talk and that he would never actually do anything to Roberto, but recently, Paul said Peter really seemed more angry than usual at Roberto. Paul reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His hand was shaking as he pulled up text messages between him and his cousin Peter. Paul held out the phone, and the detective working with Salm took it from him. Then he and Salm scrolled through a series of text messages that Peter had sent to Paul over the past couple of weeks, and in these texts were a series of very harsh criticisms of Roberto. Peter had messaged Paul to tell him that the rice fields were a total mess and that it was all Roberto's fault, and that Roberto really needed to be fired. There were also text exchanges between the cousins in which Peter talked openly about wanting to physically attack Roberto. After talking a bit longer, the conversation reached its natural conclusion, at which point Paul got up and Salm thanked him for coming in, and then after Paul had left, Salm quickly gathered the other members of his team. Peter's very hot-tempered reputation and those text messages they had just seen were enough to immediately make Peter their primary suspect. But there was something else that jumped out to Detective Salm. The ATF agent that Salm had met with said he believed whoever planted the bomb that killed Roberto would have to understand how the electrical equipment worked, because the bomb had been connected to the high-voltage system used to start the irrigation pumps. And Detective Salm knew that Peter had spent the bulk of his life on the family farm, and he had grown up learning every aspect of the business, so he would absolutely know how the electrical equipment worked. So Salm didn't waste any time. Using the text messages from Paul and evidence the ATF and FBI had found at the crime scene, Salm secured a warrant to search Peter's house and to conduct around-the-clock surveillance on him. Salm hoped he could bring this case to a close within a couple of days. On July 19th, so 3 days after the explosion that killed Roberto, Detective Salm and his team rifled through everything inside of Peter's house. As Psalm led the search, one thing kept coming into his mind, and it wasn't Peter's possible guilt or even the explosion itself. It was the bravery that Roberto's 7-year-old son Fabian had shown. This boy had been just feet away from the explosion. Shards of glass literally had flown at him, and he had seen the horrific sight of fire ravaging his father's body. But this little kid had turned and ran miles to get help. As terrified as he must have been, he had done everything he could to try to save his father. So Psalm told himself that he not only owed it to Roberto to solve this case, he also owed it to Fabian. It was Psalm's job now to do everything he could, just like Fabian had done. Psalm was standing in Peter's home office when a deputy came in to tell him that Peter and his wife had just pulled up in front of the house. Psalm nodded and went to meet them. Peter was already rushing towards the front door when Psalm stepped outside, and Peter started yelling immediately. He wanted to know what the police were doing there. And Psalm told him they had a search warrant, and so Peter knew right away that he had to be a suspect in Roberto's murder. Then Peter did something that took Psalm by complete surprise. Right there in front of his wife and other police officers, Peter launched into a tirade about how arrogant Roberto had been and how he had never liked Roberto. But Peter said that just because he didn't like Roberto, it didn't mean that he, Peter, was a killer. After this exchange, Psalm just nodded and walked back into the house to continue the search, while other officers stayed outside with Peter and his wife. The initial search of Peter's property didn't provide police with a smoking gun or anything like that, but they did confiscate Peter's computers and his cell phone. And when Psalm left the house, he was still convinced Peter was the killer. This guy couldn't even contain his hatred for the victim, while police were actively searching his house. But as investigators began their surveillance of Peter and they continued to search other properties that belonged to Peter, this case would take a baffling turn. And Detective Psalm would soon start to feel like he was living in some kind of Hollywood crime thriller. On the morning of August 12th, almost a month after Roberto's murder, Detective Psalm sat down at his desk at the sheriff's department, and when he did, he saw there was an envelope with the words Ayala case written on it. The words had been made with a label maker and then photocopied onto a piece of paper, and the small envelope had 8 stamps on it, way more than were needed to send it in the mail. Psalm opened the envelope and took out a letter that was addressed to the investigators. Just like the front of the envelope, the words in the letter had been created with a label maker and then copied. Psalm and his team had spent the past few weeks continuing their surveillance on Peter Moore. They still hadn't found any evidence tying Peter directly to the crime scene, but Psalm was confident they were getting close. In fact, Peter's uncle had provided Psalm with a phone message in which Peter had called, begging his uncle to talk to get Peter's father to put Peter back in his will. After that, Psalm had discovered that Peter's father, one of the Moore brothers, had not only cut Peter out of his financial inheritance, but he also had cut Peter completely out of the family business. So Peter wouldn't take over at all when the Moore brothers retired. Instead, Paul would run the company, and Roberto Ayala would be his right-hand man. All of the clues in this case pointed right to Peter, as far as Detective Psalm was concerned. But now Psalm was staring at this bizarre letter, and he had no idea what to think. The letter was written by a man who claimed to be a hired assassin. The assassin said that he had been paid to take out Roberto by a well-known violent international criminal gang called MS-13. The assassin said that Roberto's brother had tried to rip off members of MS-13 in an international drug deal, and so they had Roberto killed as revenge. But that wasn't all. The assassin said MS-13 wanted him, the assassin, to strike again and kill Roberto's brother and other members of his family next. But this assassin said they had seen the light and did not want to kill anyone anymore, so he was now trying to help the police without giving himself up. Psalm put the letter down and just stared off into space for a minute. He was a detective in a small sheriff's department in a small county. This case was already bigger than anything he'd ever dealt with, and now he had this letter from an assassin like a cop would get in some kind of a crazy action movie. None of this made any sense to Psalm, and he was at a loss for what to do next. So he reached out to his new contacts in the ATF and the FBI and shared the letter with them. The federal agents agreed with Salm that the letter was very strange, but they didn't want to ignore any possible lead. And so they started to investigate the MS-13 crime group to see if they could find any connection to Roberto, his brother, or anybody else in the county. Then, 2 days later, Detective Salm was back at the station, and he found another envelope with the same kind of label on it as the last one sitting on his desk. And when he opened this envelope, he found a single page with a detailed diagram of the bomb that was supposedly used to kill Roberto. Salm immediately contacted ATF agents, and when they looked at this diagram, they confirmed that it matched the type of homemade bomb they believed had killed Roberto. So whoever sent this diagram, professional assassin or otherwise, definitely had intimate details about the murder weapon. So, over the next week, the investigation shifted focus to MS-13 and the letters Salm had received. Still, Salm never gave up on the idea that Peter Moore had been involved in Roberto's murder in some way. But Salm still could not find clear evidence that could tie Peter to the murder. And investigators also couldn't identify or locate this mysterious assassin who had supposedly sent these letters. So Salm and his team started to lose hope. They had felt kind of overwhelmed from the beginning of this investigation, and now things had gotten so crazy and far-fetched that they couldn't even see how they were going to figure out what had really happened to Roberto. And Salm really felt guilty, like he was letting Fabian and the rest of Roberto's family down. On August 20th, over a week after that first letter arrived, Salm was sitting at his desk. At this point, he almost expected something totally bizarre and straight out of a movie to happen daily in this investigation. And almost on cue, Salm's phone rang. He answered, and he heard a muffled voice on the other end. Salm asked who was calling, but the person wouldn't say who they were. They simply said they had information about Roberto's murder that investigators needed to hear. Then, the caller said one simple thing and hung up. And once again, Detective Salm sat there stunned. This just seemed like more crazy movie stuff to him. But then, he felt a jolt of energy. Something the anonymous caller said suddenly made complete sense to Salm. He got up from his desk and called his team together. Then he contacted the federal agents who had been working with them. Salm told them all about this phone call he just got, and then he showed them a piece of evidence that he thought supported what the caller had just said. And everyone on the team thought Salm was definitely onto something. It would take several weeks for investigators to put everything together, but they would eventually figure out what happened to Roberto out on that isolated farm road. Based on the anonymous phone call and evidence discovered throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened on the day of Roberto Ayala's murder, July 16, 2011. A flashlight clicked on, but it was still very dark on the secluded farm road. The sun wouldn't come up for a few hours, and the bomber thought there was something eerie about this place in the total darkness, like someone or something could be hiding anywhere out in the rice fields, watching. The bomber shook off those thoughts, though, and followed the beam of light down the road towards the wooden pole with the large metal box attached to it. The bomber wore all black and had a large black bag slung over their shoulder. The bomber walked down the road and eventually reached the pole, at which point they put the bag on the ground. Then they opened up the high-voltage metal box and then crouched down and unzipped their bag. They shined the flashlight into the bag, and they could see the homemade pipe bomb they'd constructed. It hadn't been easy, but everything they had read made them feel confident that this pipe bomb would function the way it was supposed to when the time came. The bomber reached into the bag and slowly and carefully began to set up the pipe bomb inside of the metal box. There was a line that would be pulled when the door to the box was opened and the irrigation switch was flipped, and that line would engage a trigger that would set off the explosives inside of the pipe bomb. As the bomber worked, they could feel sweat dripping down their forehead, but they took a deep breath, kept their hands steady, and finished the job. The bomber closed and locked the door to the metal box and exhaled. Then they walked back down the farm road to their vehicle and drove into the darkness. Now all they had to do was wait. Hours later, at around 1 p.m., Roberto parked his white F-250 truck on the road and told his son Fabian he'd be right back. Roberto stepped out of the truck, and before he began walking down the road, he turned around and glanced back at his truck, and he smiled. He could see Fabian looking back at the sunflower field in the distance. Roberto turned back around and continued walking towards the pole, and as he did, he put on his electrical gloves, and then when he reached the pole, he opened up the door to the high-voltage metal box and flipped the switch to start the irrigation system. The explosion was enormous and instantaneous, and Roberto actually died instantly from electrocution coming out of the box. But as his body fell to the ground, it was wreathed in flames caused by the explosion of the pipe bomb. The ground shook, and in the truck, Fabian was covered in pieces of glass from the shattered windshield and windows. But Fabian remained courageous and leapt out of the truck and ran towards his father, who was literally on fire. Fabian thought about trying to reach through the flames to pull his dad's phone out of his jeans pocket to try to call for help, but the fire was just too much. And so after taking one last look at his dad, the 7-year-old turned and just started running. Later that afternoon, one of the Moore brothers' phones rang. It was the police, and they were telling him what had happened to Roberto. He hung up and he started crying. Then he looked across the table and told his son what he just heard. His son looked stunned. He said there was no way this could be true. But as an outward expression of hurt and confusion came across the son's face, internally, the son felt completely relieved because he knew his homemade pipe bomb had just worked. Paul Moore had killed Roberto, not his cousin Peter, who Paul immediately had thrown under the bus. It would turn out that Paul hated Roberto just as much as Peter did, but Paul did a better job hiding it. And when Peter had lost his inheritance and his chance to someday run the family farm, Paul had begun to fear that his father and uncle could do the same thing to him. And then the Moore brothers had begun to talk about possibly making Roberto a financial partner in the business, and at that point, Paul had just had enough. And so Paul got to work building his pipe bomb. He knew Roberto's irrigation schedule, so he knew exactly when and where to plant the bomb. While he waited for the day to come that he would be able to kill Roberto, Paul began accumulating evidence that would send investigators directly to his cousin Peter. In fact, Paul was the man who had brought ATF and FBI agents the piece of metal found in the canal that made it clear Roberto had been killed with a bomb. But when investigators failed to arrest Peter right away, Paul had decided he would need to throw them even further off of his trail. Paul was the one who had created the letters from the assassin, and he had dreamed up the story about Roberto's brother being connected to MS-13. Paul thought it was a perfect plan, like something right out of a movie. But it was actually the fake assassin letters that eventually got Paul busted. The anonymous caller who contacted Detective Salm told him that he was looking into the wrong cousin. Paul, not Peter, was the guilty party. At first, Salm had thought the anonymous caller was maybe just Peter trying to now throw suspicion on Paul, but then, as Salm thought about it, something from early on in the case came back to him. In the text message exchanges between Peter and Paul often used numbers as abbreviations for words, like using the number 4 in a sentence like, "I have something for you." He would actually put the 4 instead of FOR. And when Salm went back to the letters from the supposed assassin, it turned out the assassin used the same type of abbreviations. And so with this anonymous call, which by the way would stay anonymous, we don't know who called that in, and the connection between Paul's texts and the assassin's letters, Salm and his team searched Paul's home. And tucked away in his office, they found evidence that did link him to the diagram of the bomb that the alleged assassin had sent to the police. And soon after that, police arrested Paul. Paul was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Roberto's son, Fabian, who had so bravely tried to run to save his father on the day he was killed, spearheaded a project to erect a memorial in his father's honor at the elementary school where Roberto had gone as a child. And in 2022, Fabian graduated from high school as a varsity football and soccer star.
Dream so high, side by side, just you and I. Every moment feels so right. In the silence of the night, we rise beneath the waves where shadows hide.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out the rest of our studio's podcasts, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Run Fool. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts.